rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting drunk. In a black and white picture, there's a lot of gray funk. Man, you're hitting their books and hitting their streets. Won't be hard to find. Tell new questions, asking me to hide. Asking me to hide.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lies, More Lies, and Damned Media Lies. The title of our podcast is a bastardization of Mark Twain's Lies, Damned Lies, and Statistics. We'll look at the sins of omission and commission of today's print, television, and digital media in the line not only of Twain, but also A.J. Liebling, Alexander Colburn, and Beavis and Butthead. I'm Dennis Bro, journalist, novelist, media critic.
And I'm Jaleesa Dugro, an independent journalist.
And we're Bro.
And Dugro.
Going at the news. Okay, today's episode, when I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun, a line attributed to Hermann Goering, the Nazi in charge of the buildup of Hitler's forces to wreak havoc on Europe and Europe's minorities, has its equivalent in the Trump administrations and Netanyahu's Zionist regimes. When I hear the word negotiation, I reach for my bombs. And indeed, this is the stance. The murder of negotiators by the apartheid genocidal state of Israel and its erstwhile ally, Trump and his real estate goons, is a long and dishonorable tradition that has recently accelerated. In Trump 1, the Iranian hero General Soleimani, praised for his defeat of ISIS and al-Qaeda, was lured to Iraq by an invitation to negotiate a peace settlement and then assassinated at the airport by Trump's bombs. As negotiations between Israel and Hamas were being demanded by the world to stop the genocide, the Zionist response was to murder Hamas's chief negotiator, who was in Iran, to attend a presidential inauguration. Even Trump admitted that the Iranian negotiating team at the recent talks feared imminent death, not as he claimed by their own people, but by a desperate U.S. In 2025, with a breakthrough on the nuclear issue close, the U.S. partner Israel attacked Iranian nuclear facilities, and the Iranians were forced to walk away. Same outcome recently in Oman, with the Iranians announcing a deal was imminent and the U.S. leaving and attacking. Reaching for my bombs has also been the Israeli response, not just to combatants, but also to media figures as well, who attempt to tell the truth about Iran and its now for 47 years of being tortured by the might of the U.S.-Israeli juggernaut, now including not only the killing and arrest of journalists reporting on the ground, and we'll have more of that in this show later, but also the $1 billion bounty placed on the head of the main media spokesman for the Iranian cause, the extremely eloquent professor of American Studies and decipherer of Orientalism, Mohammad Marandi. And of course, this reaching for my gun and my bombs also includes the over 260 journalists killed in Gaza and Lebanon for trying to tell the truth about the genocide in the former and the Gazification of the latter. And in the case of the journalists, many were not killed as collateral damage, but were specifically targeted by the Israelis. Meanwhile, while Palestinian and foreign journalists are dying, our own mainstream media remains, for the most part, compliant in the killing. This headline from the LA Times about the current state of negotiations is indicative. A defiant Iran leaves Trump with few options. A stance crafted in sympathy with the Trump White House, where its leaders have threatened to end a whole civilization, presumably one of the options he has left. Iran's defiance amounts to resistance to a defense of its 7,000-year-old heritage, since its defiance consists of attempting to stop its obliteration. The LA Times apparently would rather that Iran simply allow its civilization to be destroyed. The New York Times, of course, chimes in with a pro-AI article headed, "This is what should unite the right and left on AI." The opinion page column urges the Trump administration to resolve its feud with Claude and Mythos creator Anthropic in order to strengthen U.S. defense with the Mythos program needed to counter cyber attacks. This is what the Times urges as a healing of an AI rift, which is hardly a rift at all, since Anthropic, which will not go along with AI for domestic surveillance or for non-human targeting on the battlefield, is perfectly fine with and employed on the foreign battlefield. No mention, as Jeffrey Sachs pointed out recently on George Galloway's Mother of All talk shows, that one reason for renewing the war is that Silicon Valley can test its AI targeting on actual live war site. A better uniting of the left and right would be making the case against AI's unemploying of its own workforce, such that Microsoft, allied with OpenAI, announces canceling 7% of its employees the same day Meta announced cutting 10% of its. And speaking of canceling journalists, Jeff Bezos' Amazon, the day it announced the firing of 300 employees at the Washington Post, also proudly announced appropriating $300 billion for AI development, all of which recalls the film 300, where not the brave Spartans falling on their swords, but the 300 employees are swallowed by the 300 billion in investment as journalism is replaced by mechanized homogenization. The Times owned one-sided coverage of the war of aggression launched by the U.S. and Israel against Iran is a thing to behold. The paper recently boasted about its narrow coverage in a story headlined, "How Our Iran Reporter Covers the Country Without Being in It." This brave scribe is able to surmount Iranian restrictions and reach people during what the Times calls fleeting moments of connectivity. Of course, the lie is given to this foolishness by the actual on-site reporting from Iran, first Dominique Lascaris describing the carnage U.S. bombs inflicted on civilian populations, and Armand Saladin discussing the range of support in Iran for its defense, and later the Gray Zone's Wyatt Reed, who visited and talked about the killing of over 120 girls in Minab, including one girl who survived the first bombing and then was murdered in a follow-up bombing when she went back into the school to find her brother, in what Reed labeled the worst war atrocity since the destruction of an entire village by U.S. servicemen in My Lai in Vietnam. The Times' domestic reporting is so biased and heavy-handed that even in a story about the growth of the American Association of University Professors, as teachers unionized to combat Trump's attack on education, the reporter had to chide the organization for its pro-Palestinian stance, since the group's too upfront politics, in the view of the reporter, may be hurting its attempt to attract new members, though it's just as likely that that stance in a university climate that is generally condemning of the genocide is attracting new members. While Trump reaches for his gun or bombs, the pro-genocide mainstream media journalists reach for their pens in the service not of bringing the truth to their readers, but of obscuring and confounding it. And that's our opening salvo. And before we go into a lengthy interview with Jalissa, I wonder if you had any comments on that.
Well, I think that Wyatt Reed did a really amazing job, or a pretty good job, covering his, the war in Iran right now. I also really want to give some attention to the fact that to the fact of continuing the war, or progressing it so that these open AI companies can continue to test their capabilities on the battlefield. And it kind of goes back into this like very large and aggressive cycle of the military industrial complex, and how it's a never ending cycle. And so I think that's very interesting for viewers and listeners and readers to kind of keep in mind. So I think that's interesting.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, part of this war is always that thing of testing the new devices, to see whether they're going to work or not, which is really disgusting, but that's how the war machine works.
Exactly.
Anyway, so now we're going to go into the long thing, but first I want to just show my little poster. I'm in Los Angeles. This is from May Day in Los Angeles. No a ice, no a la guerra, no to the war, from the Spanish opposition to the war. Okay, now, Jalissa, so we're going to ask you some questions and find out, because Jalissa has just come back from a long stint in Lebanon. First of all, can you give us the general contours of your reporting stay in Lebanon? Where were you in the north and south? What did you see, and what most impressed you?
So when I reached Lebanon, I initially stayed inside of Beirut. There was strikes quite frequently in Beirut, so I was staying in Hamra. And then when I was in the south, I was staying in Sur, or Tir, and I went to multiple cities inside of the south, including Nabatea and some surrounding areas. So that's where I was. What did I see and what most impressed me? I'll say what most impressed me was the resilience of the citizens. When I first got there, I think I said in a previous interview when I was in Lebanon that nothing prepares you of course, because as an American, we don't live, this is not our reality. And so, hearing a bomb drop next to me, like less than a 5-minute walk away, it was very difficult.
It's not our reality. It's the reality we inflict on other people.
It is, absolutely. It's the reality that we inflict on other people and these countries. And so this is because of us. And so it was very obviously surreal being there and hearing bombs drop, like less than a mile away from you all night. And so, there was, I have a healthy respect for fear and for death. Obviously, I think if you didn't, you probably shouldn't do this job. And so when I was there, there was a point where I was afraid. I was like, oh my gosh. And I just kind of looked around outside. I opened the window and I just see the civilians walking around, and they're walking around, they're getting food. They're in their homes. I can see windows open, and I just think, well, if this is their reality, like I can handle this. But I want to say that it's like not like they have a choice. They don't have a choice. It's very hard for a lot of them to evacuate or flee. And so I just want to say the resilience of the Lebanese people impressed me the most.
Now, a little later, we're going to get into what happened to you in the South, but were there moments when you were actually in, in real danger, fear for your life?
When I was in the South, I was in Jebel Al Hospital. And while I was there doing an interview with, I want to say, the director of the hospital, Avishai, the spokesperson for Lebanon, announced that they would be striking that area. And so they had to, we had time to finish the interview. But after that, everybody was kind of ushering us to leave and hurry up and get out. And then I want to say that following evening, a residential building was struck just a couple minutes away. I mean, less than 5. And so we were all not able to leave the hotel where we were all staying. And so that was pretty scary. I would say another one was when I was in Nabatea, and a bomb, that's all I can say, is a bomb, a projectile of sorts, was right next to us. And so I had to get out quite quickly. And so that, like, this is the reality is, Israel is striking indiscriminately. It doesn't matter where. The reality also is that you cannot come in or out. It's very dangerous rather to drive to and from the South in the dark. It's quite dangerous during the day. So, you kind of have to get what you have to get done within a allowable time period. It's very, very dangerous.
And why in the dark? Because the missiles can strike and you won't see them?
Israel is very active at night. You'll find just more often than not, they're extremely active at night when it comes to striking cars. Again, not to erase what they do during the day, absolutely. But, when it comes to striking cars and buildings, it's typically when people are driving at night or when they're sleeping in their beds. And so it's very dangerous. You just try not to be on that main road from north to south.
Okay. And very brave of you, and very different from the times how a reporter covered Iran without being there.
When you said that, I was looking at that and I was like, okay.
An actual story. They were boasting about the fact that he was nowhere near it. How ingenious. Anyway,
I know.
Okay. All right. In the opening, we talked about Israelis and Americans killing negotiators. There's also the breaking of negotiations. Can you tell us about Israel's response to the ceasefire, its Operation Eternal Darkness, in which after the ceasefire was declared, they bombed Beirut and killed 400 people in Lebanon?
Israel's never adhered to a ceasefire in its entire existence. Even when we had the November 2024 ceasefire, I believe, in Lebanon. Wait, no, I think it was 2023. Whatever. It was the ceasefire from the last war, and it was in November. And Israel continued striking for 15 months inside of South Lebanon, and Hezbollah did not retaliate once. And they were, I would say, exercising strategic patience there. But it only goes to show that Israel continues to strike beyond, established agreements such as the ceasefire. And so when we had that, I want to say it was Black Wednesday, when Israel carried out Black Wednesday, killing 400 civilians in Lebanon. By that point, I was actually out of Lebanon. But I mean, it's just devastating, because when you have an entity that can declare anybody and all infrastructure, terrorist infrastructure, there are now no red lines and no boundaries and no guidelines. And this is a violation of international humanitarian law. These are civilians. I've been there. I've gone the day after buildings have been struck, and I'm finding paint bottles and law school notes, and school books for children and toys and stuffed animals. Like, it's like people live here. These are their homes. These are their lives. And Israel is striking indiscriminately across all boards, across all homes, across all businesses, for civilians alike, and so what is their response to the ceasefire? It doesn't really change. I think people try to give a very elaborate or maybe a different answer, but let's not reinvent anything here. They really have not adhered to any ceasefire, and they will continue not to, because the unfortunate thing is that they can act without impunity from the United States, and nobody will hold them accountable.
It's very sad. The Lebanese government seems to have completely capitulated to the Americans and Israelis and are now in talks with both. Given that in Syria, this capitulation has only resulted in an Israeli land grab in the same way they are trying to do in Lebanon, what did you experience about the general attitude toward the government and about Hezbollah?
A lot of Lebanese a lot. I don't want to say majority. I don't want to get in trouble, or, I'm not trying to generalize, but a lot of Lebanese are extremely disappointed in their government. And it's kind of cozying to the United States, the United States government, as well as the idea of even entertaining the idea that Israel could somehow normalize, or, Israelis could come in and visit Lebanon. And so there was I met some people that weren't even supporters of Hezbollah, but they were like, I'm not really for Hezbollah, but I'm for sure not for Israel inside of Lebanon or reaching Beirut. You know what I mean? So, so that was my experience. It's very split. Of course, I think when you go farther north, which I dabbled a little bit in the north, it's a different world up there. They have oceanside clubs and really nice restaurants, and people it doesn't really exist there because nothing really touches kind of those different areas up in the north. But the reality is that people understand, I think the Lebanese understand, without Syria even being used as an example here, they understand good and well what would happen should Israel, if they didn't have resistance per se, rather. And it's not in comparison, it's just they've been dealing with this since the 80s. Mm. And so this is how Hezbollah was formed. And so Hezbollah is actively the only buffer and resistance standing against Israeli invasion into the country. And so I think that's very important to consider here, is that the Lebanese are well aware of this. This is not their first rodeo. You have the war in 2006, the 1980s. And so they're very familiar with this. And so I think that I would say the general attitude is that they are extremely disappointed in their government. They have faith in their country, but their government is extremely disappointing right now.
Okay. We talked about the Israelis killing reporters. What was your experience when you went to the South, and were you in imminent, or as Trump says, imminent danger? Talked about it a little bit, but something happened, as I understand, in the South, right? You were accused of...
Yes, I was accused of espionage.
Yeah.
I was accused of being an Israeli spy.
Yeah.
Yes, I was accused of being an Israeli spy or a spy for the United States government, and it's because of my prior work. I was a technical recruiter for a defense contracting company. We did not sell, arms or anything like that, or munitions or anything. I was simply recruiting for graphic designers and things like that. Also, my father was in the United States Army, and he works on base at MacDill, which is where CENTCOM is. And so this, I guess, local journalist, she's not a big fan of me, she accused me of espionage, and it blew up quite quickly to the point that I was being asked to leave the South. And eventually my embassy reached out to me and asked me if I was being followed. And they were like, we really need to get you out of the country. It's not safe for you. So that was quite scary. And it was quite unfortunate. It did cut my trip short, and it was going pretty well. So that was disappointing. But aside from that, when I was in Nabatea, like I said, that was quite scary. We had to move out of there quite quickly because of imminent Israeli bombing in Nabatea. So we had to get out of there quite quickly. And then, I was also there for when the two journalists that Israel bombed in their cars, Fatma as well as Ali, the two journalists that were killed. And I remember coming back from doing some interviews with paramedics, and all of the journalists were crying and were kind of looking around like, what happened? And they're extremely sad and distraught over the murder of their friends. And I mean, these were veteran journalists that have been doing this for a very, very long time. And, these were their colleagues. And Israel double tapped their car, and then bombed a building that I believe Fatma and her partner that she was with that day were hiding in. And so it was just, it was such a sad sight. It was, honestly, it was very eye-opening. And of course, this is not new. I'm not saying like I'm just realizing this, but it being there, of course, that it was very eye-opening that to be there in real time, seeing their reality in real life. It's now not something that you're reading on Twitter and the news and things like that. Like, you're living it and you're there, and it's like in such a split second, you really don't get to say hi or bye. You just go to work, and then, you find out that your colleagues, which I did not know them, I want to, disclose, but that your colleagues are dead. And that's unfortunate.
You said, that there was a journalist who investigated you. Your father was in the army, but also you said she didn't like you. Did she not like you because of your reporting?
She actually never actually gives a reason. She not to, we're professionals, so not to be catty. This is the third time I've been accused of this by her, and all of which I've, cleared up these allegations. It happened once last year, and then it happened it happened 2 years ago, and then this year, and then this year again. So it happened in January, and then while I was in Lebanon. I don't really know why, actually, she doesn't like me. I would like to chalk it up to the fact that I think she thinks I'm taking business away from her. Which is just kind of what I'm thinking. My reporting is, when I think about it, my reporting is very solid. My intentions are, I have good intentions. I think my reporting reflects this. It's very consistent. I've never wavered in my stance or position. And so I kind of rely on that. I try not to engage too much, but I mean, obviously that is the worst, one of the worst allegations that you can have against you in Lebanon. I mean, it is a crime to come into Lebanon as an Israeli or have an Israeli stamp in your passport. It's illegal. You'll be detained upon entry into the airport. And, so it was being alleged that I had gone to Israel and that I had Israeli stamps in my passport and all of these things, to which it was incredibly, it did become dangerous to the point that I was, all it takes is one person,
Yeah.
All it takes is one person.
And anyone who's seen your reporting wouldn't believe a word of this.
You would think. I mean, it feels like the world is small on the internet, but I had to tell myself, I'm like, Jaleesa, this is just the internet. It doesn't represent like what people actually think in real life. But yeah, like you would think, right? Like, I did a documentary last year in the South. I was pursuing one this year during my time there. I've written numerous articles on Lebanon. I've made multiple videos and done numerous interviews on Lebanon. And so I did, so yeah, it is what it is, but what can I do?
Yeah. Since you were on the ground, what did you observe about the willingness or unwillingness of the mainstream media to tell the story of what's happening in Lebanon? Were there media, mainstream media reporters in the field, in the hotels, writing from the hotel veranda, or not at all?
Lebanon is full of journalists. I mean, every corner you turn, they're kind of walking around, or they're sitting typing, or they're at these nice hotels, or you can see their cars parked on the side of the street and it's tagged with press. So they're kind of all around inside of Beirut. And then you'll see that when there were strikes inside of Beirut or, by the beach and things like that, of course, civil defense, the military, and sometimes Hezbollah, they'll show up to the sites that have been bombed. And then you'll see journalists that, of course, have that accreditation and permission to be inside of their reporting that. So that's kind of where the journalists are. It's very like spotty. Wherever things are happening, that's where they are. And then as far as the south, we were actually at the rest house in Sur. And this is a primarily good area, good hotel rather to stay in. It's, I think, one of the only areas to stay in right now that's declared a green zone, only because the UN had stayed there. So, this is a decent place to stay. It was very beautiful. It's really just unfortunate. I mean, it's just unfair and awful what's happening. It's such a beautiful, what used to be, I think, like a resort style, but it's now turned into like housing for journalists and things like that. And so you had the Times, you had Reuters, you had Sky News, you kind of have these mainstream media outlets that are down there. And so you see a lot of that. You see mainstream, independent, a lot of independent journalists, local media outlets in Lebanon, and then again, those mainstream American news outlets that are also there. I was actually kind of in a convoy with Sky News. We don't obviously know each other, but when when you go out, you kind of have to sometimes go places all together. And, I found Alex with Sky News asking like really good questions. She was like we were in Jabal Amal Hospital, and she asked the doctor, hey, they're saying that you guys are aiding and taking care of Hezbollah as patients here. Is that true? And I think that's fantastic. And we need more coverage like that. And I'm just not finding that coverage with mainstream media. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we're going to, of course, and I mean, we understand why, but we're not finding really those detailed in-depth questions. It's more like a building was bombed and it fell. And that's, I think, what we're seeing. And it's just a very, very bland, blank outline. And it's like, no, we want context. What happened? And I think that's why I enjoy my reporting, not to toot my own horn, but it's like, we want to know what's happening on the ground, who was where, what was said, who were these people, what was in the house, what kind of children, what injuries are we seeing in the children, just all of these questions. And so I don't think we're seeing that from mainstream media, but there are journalists well throughout Lebanon.
Yeah. Okay. What did you observe about broadcast journalism coverage, especially in light of the Zionist director of CBS, Barry Weiss's recent appointment of Shandy Reese, who broke the now discredited UNRWA story, which resulted in the cutting off of Gazan food and medical supplies as the network's new international bureau chief?
Broadcast journalism coverage while I was there, or just in general with Lebanon?
Yeah, well, either, however you want to answer it.
So I guess for while I was there, it would be about, the same as far as the mainstream media outlets that we saw on the ground. Like I said, it was just kind of very like general and broad that, they were there, but I just don't think asking the most amazing detailed questions as they could. But as far as I want to say, like, as far as the broadcast journalism that, let's say, I was seeing on TV, or now that I'm experiencing back home and seeing it, it's just kind of like these like empty headlines that, again, offer no context. They're not exactly giving justice, excuse me, to the civilian victims, downing an entire apartment building, or, killing 400 civilians, and then not really giving light to the fact that they're not Hezbollah, and we have like over 50 children, XYZ as an example, like being killed. It's like, are you going to do honest reporting and list out that these children are not Hezbollah? How can a child be a Hezbollah fighter? And so that's what we're seeing is lack of accountability. We're not being given context. And also we're not talking about who the perpetrator is enough. And that's really what we need to do. We're not talking about who the perpetrator is enough. I've seen these headlines from CNN, and it's like Lebanese building downed, killing 57 civilians. What do you mean? Who downed the building?
Yeah, downed, the passive verb, as if it fell itself.
Right, like it was a Jenga tower, like it was downed, like and so these are a lot of these headlines are consistent across lots of broadcast journalism with with corporate media, and so it's unfortunate. Doesn't do it justice, because it's just wrong and it's ugly and it's horrible that these civilians are dying in scores just over and over, and the tens and hundreds, thousands are dead now or have been killed now. And you have corporate media, the people that are supposed to be like the arbiters of truth and accountability, bringing this news to your doorstep saying apartment building in Lebanon downed, kills 45. What, like, it's intellectually dishonest, and it's an embarrassment to journalism.
You're right. And that's a good place to end this segment on, but we'll come back. Now to a regular feature called Times Watch, where we review and comment on stories in the New York Times and elsewhere in the mainstream media that illustrate the privileged status of those media mavens inside the Washington, London, Paris military imperial beltway and the New York financial bubble. First up is a story in the Times headed, "The U.S. Army's Big Experiment in the Arctic Cold," describing breathlessly how soldiers from the warm South climes of Florida, Texas, and Georgia are training in simulated Arctic conditions for what the paper describes as making the Arctic a now explicit theater of war, not to mention for a brave assault on the indigenous colony of Greenland, as the U.S. attempts to repeat its long history of genocidal murder of its own indigenous population, but now in the Danish colony. The colonizers like to use the word protectorate, as if rather than looting, they are protecting the population, as that population struggles to assert its independence. Greenland's abundance of minerals are essential to a Europe every day losing its sway over its former favorite looting spots in Africa. Europe attempts to assert its defense of Greenland democracy, which is really nothing more than a defense of the territory's resources. The basis of the story itself is a blind, an attempt to divert the public from what in effect the Army is actually training for, and which could end up being disastrous, and that is an assault on Iran and retaking of the now destroyed U.S. Middle Eastern bases as the late spring and summer heat approaches. That is the actual training that is going on, ignored by the Times and mentioned by Muhammad Marandi. The Financial Times recently characterized June as the tipping point for a global depression if oil still is not released from the Strait of Hormuz. June temperatures in the Gulf region are sometimes as high as 113 degrees with almost no rain, and any assault would mean American troops having to fight in that heat. But not for the Times. They're focused on Trump's winnable war in Greenland. From the Times also comes this bit of Orientalism in its story about New York Mayor Mondamis confronting the English king on his decorous visit to the city with that country's purloining of the Koh-i-Noor diamond. The story tells the backstory of how the jewel ended up in the hands of the British royals, but begins in an interesting way. Here's the opening graft. The Koh-i-Noor diamond has over the centuries been seized by Mughal emperors, Persian shahs, Afghan warlords, and other powerful leaders. Britain acquired the stone in 1849, and it now sits in the Tower of London, one of the royal family's crown jewels. Notice the differing verbs used to describe the theft of the jewels. The barbaric hordes of the East seized the jewels, while the far more civilized British in the West acquired them. Never mind that the way the British acquired the jewels was by threatening a 10-year-old to sign a treaty handing them over. Sounds like seizing to me, as it does to the governments of India, Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan, who each lay claim to the jewels and want them back, forcing the royalty to hide the jewels out of embarrassment. Elsewhere, the Times elaborately celebrated the Bezos takeover of New York for the Met Gala, where traffic was halted as the happy couple who had seized Venice for their wedding made their way into town. The Times at last had reason to crow, picking its top 20 most fashionable appearances while neglecting to mention until 2 days later that Chris Smalls, who successfully organized a union in Amazon's Staten Island warehouse, but who was subsequently fired, was arrested in a protest outside the gala. This, as Amazon is busily at work employing its AI to entirely automate its workshops, the company's answer to Small's union organizing. None of this marred the Times' exuberant coverage of the event. Finally, two stories in the at least usually more subtle Financial Times were equally repulsive. The recent attempted coup by fundamentalists in Mali as part of an overall Western effort to destroy the three African Sahel countries, which also include Burkina Faso and Niger, openly in rebellion against their former colonial masters, was covered in the FT not as a Western-based coup attempt, but as a failure by Russian forces who are defending the region's revolutions to adequately step up to the task and meet the attack. The paper framed the attack instead not as imperialist aggression, but in Cold War terms as allowed by Russian incompetence. On Substack, the Coalition for the Elimination of Imperialism in Africa saw the attack differently, issuing a statement saying it, quote, condemns the barbaric aggression by an alliance of NATO-backed terrorist groups against the Republic of Mali. The statement continued, in one of the largest coordinated attacks against Mali in recent years, 7 cities across the country were targeted by terrorist groups, including the capital Bamako and the garrison city of Kati. The simultaneity of the attacks, the targets, as well as the weapons and logistics of this operation demonstrate this was a decapitation strike with the aim of overthrowing the government of Assimi Goïta and putting an end to the Malian revolution. Despite the FT's emphasis on Russia's failure, the attacks did not succeed in toppling the government. Elsewhere in the same issue, in the FT's promotion of rampant imperialism and degrading of the global South, its book review of a Chinese memoir titled Adrift in the South, about the decades when China was at work raising over 800 million people out of poverty, recounts the bitterness of a single factory worker who says the best decades of his life slipped away from him on the factory floor. No doubt, there was a human cost to this attempt to lift an entire population out of dire poverty, often detailed by Chinese filmmakers like Wayne Bing and Zhu Zhangke. But in the FT's assessment, there's no room for nuance or recognition of the triumph, only bitterness, which in the end, given away the Chinese miracle and planned economy every day dwarfs the financialization and moral bankruptcy of the West, begins to sound less like critique and more like sour grapes. And that's Time's Watch. And I wonder if you have any comments.
Yeah, I love that last line. But as far as the commentary about the crown jewels, I particularly love that because it really highlights the way that the Western colonialism tends to whitewash or glaze over or alter this language, to make ourselves look more presentable or justified. And so the comment about how we acquired them, but these other countries seized them, as if we could possibly paint ourselves as justifiable and definitely not thieves, which I believe we've also done with artwork.
Oh, yes, for sure. Yes. France has just said, Macron 2 years ago visited one of the African countries and said, we're going to give the paintings back. Well, 2 years later, France has finally started to talk about a law which might allow them to do that. And they've got to give them back. They've got lots of African art. And in the West, the thing about this is they say, you know what? The Africans just can't build museums, so they're better kept in the West. Well, they're building museums, and B, a lot of what would be in the museums has been stolen by the West. So.
And also, if they tried building a museum, we would probably bomb it.
Yes, there's that.
There's that. That's exactly what we would do.
There is that, for sure. Yeah. Okay, well, yeah. So now, do you want to say something in terms of narrative watch or the overall narrative that we're watching unfold?
The overall narrative that we're seeing, I kind of spoke about it before in our interview about Lebanon. Again, it's like I wouldn't even call it a strategic omission in the headlines that we're seeing. It is just a very calculated and lazy headlines that we're seeing. So when you're reading this, I just want you, I would advise viewers and, our listeners to invest in looking towards more independent media that will report honestly and, I will say objectively, to at least put a name to the perpetrators, give us accurate casualty counts, and provide context. I think that's so important, that provides context, because corporate media is not doing that. And as I said before, it's very strategic and calculated.
Yep.
In the language that we're using to kind of soften this. Buildings were downed, children are dead, right? Not killed. Something was struck. It wasn't bombed by Israel. And so this is something that we need to pay attention to. And I think we shouldn't stop hounding corporate media over it, even though this is like a decades-long problem. But we should not stop hounding corporate media out of it, and definitely support third-party or independent media outlets, like listening to this podcast.
Yes. And also, I decided that it's best to not to, while we're doing the podcast, since you mentioned it last time, to say where our sources are and what media we're listening to for people to listen to,
Oh, that's a good idea.
these outside sources are coming from, like Mohammed Morandi really doesn't appear very much on mainstream media, only sometimes in jousts with Piers Morgan, but otherwise an eloquent spokesman, who they just simply labeled an Iranian asset. Well,
Yeah.
what are most mainstream media? What are the CNN reporters?
Exactly. It's such a one-minded, such a singular lens view.
Yeah.
Because if that's how we see them, how do they see us? But it's like we could never be that. It's exhausting. But you're right.
And it's about to get a lot worse because it's already getting there. But if Paramount takes over Warner Brothers and CNN, that's another thing which is going to fall. And the Oracle and its head, David Ellison and his father, are extremely ideological, backers of Israel, who are really trying to, in a way, kind of mow the lawn, as Israel would say, of any kind of dissent and to erase it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're seeing these changes, and they're coming fast, in mainstream media. So it's a big deal to oppose this merger. It's a very sinister thing, not only for jobs here in LA, which people are very afraid of, but also for a takeover by one person who, the Ellisons now control TikTok. They control CBS News. And they soon, if this goes through, will control CNN. And that's too much for one mogul family.
It is, to monopolize the media in this way. It's quite scary. All with a clear idea, a clear ideology. And I think Barry Weiss just fired somebody from CBS, just to kind of give an example, because they wouldn't align with Israeli talking points.
Yep.
And I mean, not allowing dissenting opinions. I'm all for dissenting opinions, honestly. It really, but to monopolize the media in this way, it is truly scary.
It is. And we have to keep in mind, too, that the reason for this is that they've lost the battle of public opinion, or they lose more of it every day. And so their answer is to take over mainstream media, even as people desert mainstream media. And they are, as Glenn Greenwald says, they are deserting, en masse CBS News, which is proving itself to be really quite incompetent,
Yeah, it's kind of a gift from Barry Weiss to Barry Weiss. It's a little bit of what she deserves. But people are losing faith in corporate media, which is fantastic, I think. I think it's totally amazing to divert from that, because the views are going to go down, the ratings are going to go down. You can buy it all, but the Americans are waking up. We're seeing corporate media for what it is, and it's all a copy and paste. They're two wings of the same bird, which is why, third party and independent media is so important. But I think it's really interesting because I would say confidently that Israel, but as well as the United States government right now, is kind of losing the PR war per se, popularly by young Americans who have taken up for the cause in Palestine as well as Lebanon, or just, the Swana region in general, but are also really realizing the dangers that Americans are facing, given AI, monopolization of, the media. And so you have this genre, but also huge majority of Americans that are waking up and abandoning these otherwise trusted outlets and laws and things like that.
Yes, for sure. Well, okay. So now we're going to go at this in a slightly different way. I wanted to end with a review of two series which highlight ever-widening differences between the American and the global ethos, which is, I guess, brings us back to what we're talking about. So it's called Nowhere Men: The Global versus the American Action Film Hero. The genre and the basic plot is the same, but two series highlight differences in a more individualized, oligarchic, and paternalistic version of the black hero in the American Man on Fire, and the more socially grounded and collectivist South African The Nowhere Man. The genre is the action series, and both are loosely based on the Denzel Washington film Man on Fire, with the Netflix American series remake explicitly acknowledging this lineage. The basic plot of each treads the well-worn platitudes of that genre. Each lead is laid low by a mission that, in the Netflix firmly fixed pattern, is an action sequence in the opening. In the American, the CIA outsourced agent fails in the endeavor, resulting in the death of his Mission Impossible type team. And in the South African version, the Army Special Forces agent, in a more taut action sequence, detonates a device at the last minute which gets him out of harm's way. The African American and African actors in each then wander the streets, seemingly lost, though reclaimed, and then reluctantly drawn back into new missions of vengeance. The pattern, of course, is problematic, with the genre needing to supply adequate reasons for the carnage that is to follow and for the audience to wallow in it. It's the same kind of twisted and inaccurate logic with the hero as victim that Pete Hegseth, Trump, and previous American administrations use every day as they present themselves, with the largest armed force ever assembled, including the greatest nuclear arsenal, as righteous victims of one country after another, be it Iran, China, or Russia, as the endless wars rage, always justified by some revenge motif fostered by bruised masculinity. And so went the films of Sylvester Stallone, some of the films of Clint Eastwood and Chuck Norris, all forgetting in their bloodlust that the moral of the original revenge film, Fritz Lang's Nibelungen, is that revenge exhausts not only itself, but also the revenger. There are major differences, though, in the execution of these similar stories. The American version at first appears to be the more global, set initially in Mexico, then in the US, and finally in Brazil's Rio, while the South African version is set in Cape Town. However, the global locales featured in Man on Fire are viewed through the eyes of the privileged. The Mexico opening sequence is set in one of the country's exploited free trade zones, and the Brazilian locale is the upscale neighborhood of the gleaming business offices and condos of Lebanon, with the mercenary John Creasy remarking that he thought Brazil would be tougher, and his handler replying, "Not this neighborhood," while explaining these ex-CIA operatives hired to secure this extravagant wealth are there because, in CIA lingo, home is where the coup is. Creasy's handler, Rayburn, though he is expert at undermining regimes, is presented as a family man whose attitude towards his wife, two youngsters, and rebellious teenage daughter is described as loving, and which justifies his wrecking of other ways of life. His sanctimonious fatherhood, of course, is an excuse that will later serve to sanction Creasy's killing spree. The terrorists, focused on rampant destruction for seemingly no reason, as terrorists are wont to do, are, to read between the lines, actually incensed with the inequality of the ultra-rich condo dwellers, but we just view them as villains since we're given no reference point or insight into the actual poverty of the favelas or the slums of Rio. Creasy is described as the ultimate loner, always solitary in his grief over the failed mission, though he will eventually learn to allow for at least one other person in his life in his protection of the teenage daughter, Poe, but that is the extent of his community and commonality. Lucas in The Nowhere Man, on the other hand, in retreat from a sad experience with the South African army, falls into the same type of isolation, but is rescued off the street by Ruby, who heads a shelter for women, children, and victims of violence. Lucas, no longer a loner, embeds himself in the community outside the limited bourgeois family structure depicted in the American series. Lucas is called back into action when Neo, a female member of a drug family, is threatened because she will testify against her drug lord uncle. His rescuing of Neo and eventual invasion of the drug lord's compound entails a good deal of black-on-black violence, but drug dealers are a menace to the community, and their evil is distinct from the obscure terrorists of Man on Fire. Lucas becomes enamored not of a privileged and precocious teen, but of a medically challenged girl who he and Ruby attempt to save. Neo is a doctor who, when rescued, helps out at the shelter, though Ruby, the shelter originator, ultimately functions as the revenge and bloodletting motif. There are American comparisons. Lucas is called a South African John Wick, but the more apt comparison of Lucas's feats is to Black Marvel superhero Luke Cage. Likewise, Neo in her speech effect and appearance seems to be channeling Scandal's Kerry Washington. Finally, there's a reformed addict at the shelter who ultimately functions as Robin to Lucas's Batman. Lucas then moves away from being the ultimate individual, first inserting himself into a community and then building a community around him in his protecting the shelter, whereas the American protagonist, Creasy, pledged to protect the teenage Poe, otherwise continues on his individual path in defense of Rio's rich and privileged. Two Black action heroes, but in context and circumstances that differ substantially and tellingly in the way they illuminate the values of each society that produced these figures.
Very interesting. And this was from the same show? Well,
it's from this Denzel Washington movie, Man on Fire. That's what the American is just a remake of the show. But as I was watching it, I realized I'd seen The Nowhere Man a little earlier, and then I saw Man on Fire, and I realized, oh, it's the same story, just kind of uncredited, you know. But so both of them are essentially the same story, and yet the differences between the South African culture and the American culture are kind of interesting, you know.
Is there a positive versus or negative framing between the two, you would say?
Yes, I would say the South African action series is more valuing of community.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the American series is simply individual.
That would make sense.
And that in the South African series, he's sort of defending the neighborhood. And the neighborhood is a poor neighborhood. Whereas in the American series, he's defending the neighborhood too. It's an ultra-rich condo.
Oh, interesting.
Where everyone else is poor, is impoverished. So there you go.
Color me shocked. Color me shocked.
Yes, how on earth could that take place?
We don't even know.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, so we will conclude. This is Bro.
And Dugro.
Going
at the news.
And we'll be back next time with more lies. And I just want to repeat again, no a la ice, no a la guerra. And that's it for today's show. We'll be back soon.